And now, it's time for your Low Country Real Estate Market Update. It's the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show. Brian is one of the top 1% real estate agents in Charleston. Find him online at listingsincharleston.com. That's listingsincharleston.com. Or call him at 843-800-0065. That's 843-800-0065. Now, broadcasting from the WTMA studios, here's your host, Brian Beatty.
Welcome to the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show right here on the Big Talker, 1250 WTMA and WTMA.com. I've got an exciting show for you guys today. I am actually live in the studio right now, and so I'm going to take your calls today. Any topic you guys have in mind, any questions you have about the real estate market, I've got the MLS pulled up. I figured it might be kind of cool for some of you to call in and ask me what's going on in specific areas, and I can get really granular with some of that data. So if you've got questions about the market, you have questions about the process, or you just want to hear an entertaining show about real estate over the course of the next hour, then you're in the right place. Now, the number to call if you want to be on the show and ask a question is 843-556-1250. That's 843-556-1250. And of course, if you want to reach out to me personally off air, you have a question that you want to ask me about your specific situation. Maybe you're thinking of buying or selling a home or investing in real estate, or you have a property you'd like for us to manage, then my personal phone number is 843-800-0065. That's 843-800-0065. So we're also going to be joined here in just a little bit by Rex Ann Strecker. And so she'll be live on the air as well if you have any mortgage-related questions. But we're going to kind of go back and forth with regard to the market and just what we're seeing right now. And so that's kind of the plan for the show. Again, we're live. We're here to answer your questions. So don't be bashful. Give us a call, 843-556-1250. And if I can get this computer here in the studio to work, then I can answer some questions specifically about any area of the market you'd like to know. But that's what we're going to start with, is we're just going to start in general with what's happening with the real estate market. And so, you know, we're in March now. We've had a really, I think, busier than expected beginning of the year. We're not seeing much in the way of more inventory hitting the market. You know, it seems like every time we have a nice little bump in new listings, those listings get sold. They get absorbed. And so typically when we look at like the beginning of the year, the amount of new listings that hit the market stays kind of a little flat for January and February. In fact, usually it tends to go down just a little bit based on seasonality of the market. And then it really picks up right now into April and May as being the top 3 months for new inventory and for sales. So there's certainly some seasonality to our market. But what we're finding is the month's supply of inventory, which is really what we use to kind of measure the health of a real estate market, right? It takes a look at the number of listings over the amount of properties that are going under contract in a 30-day period. And so basically what they say is that a healthy market where appreciation is kind of in line with inflation, you know, we're hoping for that 2-3% mark, right, is about 6 months worth of inventory. Right now we're still at 2. It's climbed up a little bit, but we've been in the 1.5 to 2.5 months range for a little over a year now. So in my mind, the market is still kind of chug along. What's interesting is that although we're not really seeing an increase in inventory, and we're not really seeing that much of an increase in pending sales, we are seeing prices continue to go up. If I look at and you can look at that a few different ways, but prices are certainly going up. You could look at it from a sales price perspective, where we look at like the median sales price. Right now, that's up almost 6% from this time last year. You could also look at something like price per square foot, which is an interesting way of looking at it. And we've talked a lot on this program about how we value real estate, right? How we go about the process of identifying what that value of that home should be, not what Zillow or Redfin thinks your home is worth, but what the property will actually sell for based on current consumer behavior, demand, lack of inventory, so on and so forth, right? What we can prove through data. And even prices per square foot are up a little over 3%. So market's still strong. You know, we still find that if we have a property that is priced attractively, I'm not even going to say priced obviously anything priced below market right now is getting snatched up almost immediately. And that is, in fact, a strategy that some sellers use to sell property. But even if you're, a few percentage points over the ask or over what we think that property will sell for, it's still getting a ton of attention. We have some listings that when we hit the market, they're getting multiple showings per day. Sometimes, 10 on the really hot areas, 20 showings per week before we review what will likely be multiple offers on the property. And that's in, I think, a lot of areas of Charleston right now. You've got some of the entry level price ranges in Somerville, North Charleston, Goose Creek, Monk's Corner. Those properties sell very, very quickly. And it's because there are more buyers for them just based on the nature of what they sell for and based on the nature of what people can afford. Some of the higher price properties, we're seeing the same thing, and we're selling them to people from not just all over the country, but all over the world. I mean, we just put a property under contract with a buyer of about $1 million home, and they're from Germany. And that's, I think, the third or fourth property I've sold to somebody from Germany in the past few years, which is interesting. And just on that note, when I look at like my website traffic, right, because all of that's tracked, you use Google Analytics, you look at where are the people coming from that ultimately land on your website. It's interesting stuff. For anybody that has their own website that has this data, I think you'd agree that some of what's tracked is pretty fascinating. But we're getting people that are looking for properties in Charleston from all over the world on a consistent monthly basis, just based on my own little website, which gets, a few thousand visitors a month. Obviously, that's a drop in the bucket compared to places like Zillow and Redfin, and they track that stuff too. But I think the point in saying all of that is that we as a market are in pretty darn good shape. We are getting interest from all over the country, all over the world. And in most instances, properties aren't staying on the market for more than 30 days. I mean, the days on market right now for the entire market is 20 days. If I look at just pre-owned homes, it's 21 days. Still, that's down 16% from this time last year. Meaning properties are selling faster now than they were this time last year. And last year was a tough year for a lot of folks because of the sticker shock, of course, associated with the increase in interest rates, right? We went from, at a very quick pace, we went from 3% to almost 8%. There's never been a time in tracked history where interest rates went up that quickly. The rate of acceleration, we broke a record. And so Charleston, gosh, we've been breaking records left and right. But that was one that I didn't think any of us were happy to break. But overall, I think the market is very strong. I think what we're finding right now, though, is that especially with rates being where they are, a lot of people are watching and waiting for that right property to hit the market. And then because of the interest rates, because I guess in the buyer's mind, there's got to be some negotiability somewhere in order to make sense out of the deal. They're beating up the seller just a little bit more than usual. And of course, that's going to depend on how that property is positioned, right? And so when I'm sitting down with a seller and we're talking about the process of selling their home and it comes to pricing, I sit down with them. We talk about comparable sales. We talk about, what that home has in comparison to what your home might have that's better or not as nice as those particular properties. We're finding that price that just makes sense, right? Not just from a buyer's perspective, right? Because it makes sense to put ourselves in the shoes of the buyer and say, hey, if I'm shopping for a home right now, what are my options? What am I looking at? How can we position ourselves for success based on what's currently available? And then is that backed up by properties that are similar, that have gone under contract recently or that have sold recently? And when I'm talking with folks, we also have to bear in mind the time at which those properties ended up selling, right? So let's say that I'm talking to somebody and we're selling just make up something, a 2,500 square foot home in Mount Pleasant in a fairly large neighborhood. Let's say like Park West, right? Well, we're going to look at other properties that have sold that are similar to that in that neighborhood. But if something sold 6 months ago and we're looking at that as a specific data point, then we have to ask ourselves the question of like, all right, well, how long did this property stay under contract? and what were prices like at that point in time, and how is that different from where prices are now, right? We have to account for the time and the difference in the market from then until now. And I just mentioned, for those of you that are just joining, the median sales price in the entire Charleston market is up significantly. If we look at it from this time last year, the median sales price is up 12.3%, which is incredible for pre-owned homes, at least. For all property types, it's up 6%. And so I tell you what, we've got Rex Ann Strecker that is waiting very patiently to get on this program. And so we're going to go back and forth a little bit with regard to the state of the mortgage market. We're going to talk about negotiating contracts. We're going to talk a lot, too, about, I think, where a lot of folks feel pain in the transaction, whether that is caused by just the emotions associated with buying and selling a home. Maybe it's caused by the negligence of a real estate agent, which unfortunately we run into quite often. So we're going to talk about some of those things here coming up. Again, if you want to be on the program, if you have a question for me or for Rex Ann, who will be here in just a moment, the number is 843-556-1250. That's the number for WTMA, 843-556-1250. Or, of course, if you want to reach out to me privately and have a conversation with me about possibly working together, my number, 843-800-0065 or listingsincharleston.com. So we are joined by Rex Ann Strecker, a familiar voice for some of you guys. Rex Ann, you always do a great job of getting phone calls when you're on this program. I think a lot of people have more questions about mortgages than they do about the real estate process. So we're really happy to have you here this morning. Thanks for joining us. How's life?
Life is great. It's wonderful. We are hitting spring buying season.
So we're starting to feel just the busyness of the market right now. A lot of folks are, I'd say not necessarily in a transactional mindset, but if the right thing came along, they could make sense out of moving, which I think has been kind of the mantra of the market for, at least over the past year. With all the folks that, look, I've got a 3% interest rate. I'm pretty happy where I am, but if the right thing hit the market, I might be able to make sense out of moving. That's kind of a pretty standard conversation we're having with folks right now.
Yes. And so I am going to kind of put a spin on you today, Brian. I would like to kind of pick your brain on the psyche of the market going on from the realtor's point of view, as well as from the client's point of view, because what I'm seeing out there right now in negotiations is people, you're right. So they're worried about moving off those low interest rates. They get very stressed. Consumers are making decisions emotionally more so than logically and from a perspective of business, making money, and enjoying what these appreciations have brought them. And I think overall, consumers forget that if you sell in a market like this and you make all that appreciation, it is a good time to sell because you're making a lot of money off your house. But when they're listing it, they think it's worth, top dollar. And when they want to buy, then they get all stressed out because they feel like they're paying top dollar. Mm-hmm. And what you have to kind of assess out there is from a banking point of view and a business point of view is you're also making money as you go. And so if you're in a position where you can put less down, have slightly higher, you're going to have a higher rate, higher payments. But if you keep some of that money back in your bank account and can subsidize the payment, it's actually still a very strong move to boost retirement funds and things like that going forward. So I kind of thought I'd like to ask you a couple of questions this morning where I see people kind of go wrong when they're negotiating.
Okay, I love it.
And stressing. And how, as realtors, can you guys kind of help facilitate that to kind of keep that angst down?
Yeah. So we're live in the studio right now, guys, and we've got Rex Ann Strecker with us with Preferred Rate. If you guys have questions, 843-556-1250 is the number here in the studio. So don't be bashful. Feel free to call with any question you guys have. And so I love the idea of
Yes,
putting a little,
I'm gonna
putting a
interview
spin.
you.
I was not expecting this.
I'm
All right,
gonna
so
interview you today. Oh,
this is the great thing about live radio, guys. Is you never quite know what's going to happen. So, yeah, fire away with these questions, Rex Ann. Let's go. Let's do it.
Okay, so my first question is: when you list a property, how do you prepare your sellers for the angst that's going on in the market?
So this is an important topic. And I think that, well, first of all, let me say this. And for those of you that are listening, you're probably going to shake your head up and down in agreement with what I'm about to say. There are, I think, a few different types of agents out there. There are some agents that maybe they're a little newer, or maybe this is just not their full-time job, or maybe this is just something that they don't have a ton of experience in. And, I have at times been pretty hard on those types of agents because there's added stress to the transaction.
Correct.
And the sellers or the buyers feel it. And I guess what the purpose of this show is to help educate you guys so that you're making the best decision possible for your real estate transaction in totality, a lot of which you can control based on the agent that you hire.
Correct.
And so do your due diligence, interview agents. We talk about that a lot on this program. In terms of how I prepare sellers emotionally for the process of selling their home, it is definitely a talking point. And so after we talk about, price, condition, marketing, motivation, we talk a lot about expectations. And so when we were just talking about this on this last segment, but when I sit down with somebody and I talk about, all right, let's discuss a pricing strategy based on what you ultimately want to accomplish, right? Some people want or need to sell quickly. Others really don't care how long that it takes to sell, so long as they get top dollar to make it really feel like it was worth their while.
Okay.
Right? And so
that's fair enough.
Those two different types of people or different types of situations might demand a different pricing strategy. And so in line,
definitely they do.
Yeah, and so
absolutely.
In line with that, we also have to talk about expectations. And a great way for us to kind of hone in on those expectations is by looking at some of the data that's available to us with regard to like number of showings.
Right.
Or online traffic. Now, when it comes to online traffic, there is no, I guess, industry accepted standard for how many views and clicks and inquiries a property should be getting for us to then know, hey, you're priced right. We're right in the strike zone.
We live in such a digital world anymore. It's crazy.
But it's something that I personally have tracked for years and years and years. So when I list a property for sale, I say, hey, this is what we should see from an online traffic perspective, because that's a lot of what our marketing is. Obviously, that's where people look for real estate these days. I'm sorry, but we don't put ads in the newspaper.
Right. Exactly.
We don't put stuff in magazines. I was on the front inside cover of a magazine for 8 years. I think I sold one home from it. So when we're talking about expectations, we can talk about this is what we should see from an online traffic perspective, which will then convert into showings, which will then convert into offers.
Right.
We can also look at showing data because everybody that schedules showings these days on properties does that showing or books that showing online through a service called Showing Time.
Yes.
And so they then track the data that say, all right, well, this is the number of showings that these properties in these price ranges in these areas should be getting on a monthly basis. So it's a nice kind of target for us to shoot for.
Right.
So in line with those expectations in that conversation, we're saying, hey, when we hit the market, within the first 2 weeks, we should see X number of showings. If we're at or above that number, fantastic. We've positioned it well.
Right.
If we're below or severely below that number, then we'll need to likely have a conversation about readjusting the price, repositioning the property because we missed the mark.
Right.
Now, again, that might be part of the strategy. It might be the seller that says, look, I don't need to sell my home.
I want to sell it. I don't need to. Yeah.
And if I'm going to sell it, then I have to get the most money possible. That's the only way this makes sense.
Right.
And so, of course, what a lot of people will do with that mentality is they'll overprice the property and they'll leave room for negotiations. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
Right. sometimes it means that you now have to do multiple price reductions to sell your house, and you end up selling it for less than what you could have sold it for if you just priced it at what it was worth, and then let these buyers that are still, salivating over new listings fight amongst each other. That's how you get your multiple offer situation.
You're in such a difficult pinnacle point right now in the market because we don't have much inventory, right? And then you have people that are worried, if I list my property, then I won't be able to find another property, right? Mm-hmm. And then also you have all the angst going on about moving up in interest rates and then moving back down. Rates are they're okay. They're not fantastic. I mean, but they're not.
Nothing really fun about interest rates right now.
No, nothing fun. But at the end of the day, they're still not double digits, and so we're still, and they are kind of, they're hitting for a conforming loan now. You're coming down a little bit on rate, and you're right at around 7 or below. So that's not horrific. My question is mentally, so what I've seen this past week, because like we just said, the market is booming again. I mean, the buyers are coming out of their woodwork, as they always do, because people are doing their taxes. They get their tax returns back, and they want to go ahead and buy a house. And we are back, because of low inventory, we're back to the psyche of, if you're standing in the house, you better write an offer, at least here in South Carolina. I don't know what it's like. I only know my market. How do you, as a realtor, help with the negotiations and keeping the sellers and the buyers emotionally, prepare them emotionally? Because what I'm seeing a lot in contracts is you've got angst on both sides, and then the realtors, I've had 2 contracts fall out, and I can honestly tell you it was because of how they were negotiated. Mm-hmm. That the realtor single-handedly, the listing agent, literally created so much angst between her seller and the buyer that the deals fell apart. Yeah.
Well, and there's a ton that I could say on that topic because...
Well, please elaborate. I'm interested.
Well, I think when you've done 1,500-ish transactions, mm-hmm. you get the hang of things. The first thing that I would say is that we as real estate agents are, I think, exposed to a pretty high level of trauma in our job.
PTSD?
Well, if you think about it, moving is emotional, and not every reason to move is like a happy reason.
Correct.
And that's so if I become emotional with my client, more often than not, that just exacerbates the issue.
Correct.
It makes it worse. Mm-hmm. And so I have been, I guess, accused at times of not showing enough emotion through the course of a transaction.
Okay.
I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing because it's my responsibility as your agent, as your consultant, to help guide you through this process in mm-hmm. a way that gets you the best deal possible and reduces stress as much as possible. There's no such thing as a stress-free transaction. They don't exist.
Right.
And so all these agents that are saying, hey, stress-free transactions, it's like you've obviously never sold real estate before because that's just not how it works. What we can do is we can mitigate that, and we can address it head on by talking about, hey, we've now accepted an offer on your property. The next step is for this buyer to get a home inspection. Here's what we typically see as a result of that process. I wouldn't be surprised if the buyer came back, at least initially, and asked for everything on the inspection report, which we see about half the time.
Correct. And and it makes sense. When you're negotiating, you ask for everything, you know, and then you kind of tick it off. I mean, that's just smart negotiating, really. Yeah, and
same thing with regard to like the buyer's first offer on a property. Let's say a property's been on the market for 90 days. Mm-hmm. And it's not that it's, a bad house or people don't want it. It might just be a unique property mm-hmm. that takes some time to find the right buyer.
And maybe not sings to everybody.
Exactly.
Right.
Buyers are going to be opportunistic where they can, just like sellers are going to be opportunistic where they can.
Absolutely.
And if they come in with a low offer, even if in their mind it's just designed to start a conversation. Some buyers can't help it. They just got to get it out of their system, right? They just have to offer some ridiculous amount of money
low
on a
price,
property.
right.
And they're like, well, if you don't like it, just,
Right.
counter back.
Right.
A lot of sellers will get irritated and emotionally charged when they get those low offers, and they'll say, this is ridiculous. I'm not even wasting my time with this
Right.
buyer. And I always caution sellers on that and say, look, I don't care where they start. I just care where this thing ends up.
Correct.
Let's keep the conversation going.
Just and remind them that the person that doesn't lose emotional integrity is the strongest person in the room. Like if you just go, okay, well, at least it's an offer.
We just
went through
We're
going to go up from here. Yeah.
We just went through this week. We had a property that had been on the market for a while. It actually was under contract with a buyer for several months, and the buyer couldn't perform.
Right.
Crazy situation. I don't have time to go into all of it, but it was a cash buyer that couldn't get his cash.
Right.
It was very irritating for the seller and, of course, for us as well. But, we deal with this all the time. So it had been on the market for a while. An offer comes in. It was 15% below the asking price. This is a $1 million property. And we settled at a significantly higher list to sale price ratio than that. I can't give it away because it's under contract.
Yeah,
but it's because we went back to
probably
them.
just kept everybody calm.
You know what we did?
Yeah.
We said, all right, when they made that low offer, we said, all right, we're going to take $5,000 off the asking price as our counter.
Right.
And this is designed, you made an offer to start the conversation. We're open to the conversation through our counter, but your next offer has to be something that we would consider accepting, or we're done here.
Right.
And so what's interesting is you use these little situations and tactics to gain the upper hand in negotiating. And from my perspective, and this is just tried and true over almost 20 years of selling real estate, it works.
Right.
But you got to sometimes play the game a little bit and prepare them emotionally for that process. We're going to take a quick break with more of Rex Ann Strecker of Preferred Rate on this live show. We're in the studio, guys. Give us a call. 843-556-1250 is the number. Of course, if you want to reach out to me personally, 843-800-0065. That's 843-800-0065 or listingsincharleston.com. And Rex Ann, quickly, what's your number?
843-860-0809 at preferredrate.com.
Right on. We'll be right back with more of the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show on the Big Talker 1250 WTMA. Live in the studio today, Saturday. Of course, we're going to repeat this tomorrow, so if you call, we won't be here. But you've got a chance now to call and be on the show. Ask us your real estate questions. Of course, we've got Rex Ann Strecker with Preferred Rate here to answer any mortgage-related questions you have. But between the two of us, how many years of experience do we have? I've got 19. You've got...
I have 35.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so...
Man.
Over
Don't
50 years of experience right here between the two of us to help better understand the real estate market, the process of buying or selling a home, getting financing, which is such a hot topic right now. So the number in the studio, 843-556-1250, 843-556-1250. And again, of course, if you want to reach out to me, you've got a question about the market, about buying or selling a home, the process, maybe you have a home that you'd like for us to property manage for you, then my number, 843-800-0065, 843-800-0065, or listingsincharleston.com. So, Rex, I'm kicking it back to you. And by the way, for those of you that are just joining, we've got Rex Ann Strecker here. We're live on the air, and she kind of came in and said, I'm gonna switch things up a little bit. I'm gonna ask you some questions.
I'm going to interview you this morning.
I'm up for it.
Put you in the hot seat.
Let's keep going. I love it.
Okay, so just before the break, we were talking about preparing your sellers for the listing, and you were talking about the digital numbers, which is fantastic. And what I want you to delve into a little bit more is the emotional, like you said, it's traumatic sometimes selling these homes, and it's not always for a happy reason. Maybe it's divorce or death, or we're downsizing because we're getting older and we need to. So not everybody's like fit. But what I'm also noticing is the buyers are coming in. And what I notice out there is a mortgage banker, because sometimes we're right in the fray with you, right? We're sending pre-approvals. We're talking to the buyer, and we hear everything that's going on. Oh my gosh, the sellers are doing this. So my question is, When it gets stressful, as agents, I think agents would all benefit from being, like you said, keeping the emotion out of it and being more logical. Because what I see a lot of times is they'll throw back and forth doing the addendums, and then they will add little things. So we'll have a conversation because, like we've discussed in the past, real estate is not done in verbal contracts. It is done in writing. And what happens is they'll agree to something over the phone with the agent. They'll go and talk to their seller or the buyer. And then when they get that opportunity to change it, they start amending it with all sorts of crazy little things. You know, like I for example, I have a deal that is somebody's trying to buy a $1.5 million house and has offered cash. Like that's an easy transaction. Should be, right, for an agent. And we have blowback because they wanted it to close in 30 days. Now they're down to 18 days. And it scares the buyer's scared to death. She's like, well, what's wrong with the house?
Why do I have to buy it so quickly?
Why do I have to buy it so quickly? And so, and all of this again, how as an agent on both sides, do you direct people or just even school them a little bit better to not make such these outlandish negotiation, changing stuff that quickly? If they wanted a 30-day close, then leave it as a 30-day close so that everybody feels confident. Or how do you handle that, Brian?
It's so situational, of course, but I think that people become emotionally charged for a few major reasons.
Okay.
I think number one is the agent wants to be a hero. They really want to stand out for their client, and they really want to go to bat for them. And they might have good intentions.
Right.
But the delivery is in need of some serious work. And so, I find that probably at least half the time, it's really the agent that's causing the issue rather than the buyer or the seller.
I agree.
We have
100%.
had so often we've had buyers and sellers agree on things, but then we've got the other agent introducing some sort of change, or maybe they're just being opportunistic.
Right.
To try and win something or gain some ground for their client, and all they do is end up frustrating people, emotionally charging people, and then things can get pretty messy from there.
Oh, it can fall apart.
I would also say that in the course of a transaction, you've got multiple negotiation points, right? You've got the back and forth when the offer is made and then ultimately accepted. You've got negotiations that can occur based on the home inspection, based on the termite and moisture inspection, which we call a CL 100, and the appraisal.
Correct.
And, because you have a general due diligence period, you might also find something as you're, sifting through covenants and restrictions or, something along those lines. And so you've got all these different opportunities to negotiate. And what I typically find is that if one side of the transaction is being particularly difficult, but they get their way, as soon as the tide turns and the other side of the transaction has the upper hand and needs something, then they really take advantage of that situation.
Right.
So,
because it was so difficult to get into under contract.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, let's say as an example that, and I'm just going to make up a scenario, but let's say that a buyer makes an offer on a house. The buyer beats the seller up a little bit on the initial negotiations. The seller ultimately agrees to that contract amount. Then the home inspection comes and, again, the buyer is asking for more repairs than what a typical person would deem reasonable.
Correct.
But they're being really tough about it. And so the seller agrees. And then we get to a few days before closing and the lender needs another week to close.
And so the seller's
now
just beyond.
So now the buyer is in a position where they have to ask the seller to extend the contract. And that's when the seller's going to say, oh, yeah, we'll extend it for another $1,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Or for something, you've beaten me up this entire time, so now's my turn.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but
it happens.
But it happens. Yeah. And so, again, preparing the client by saying, hey, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to help provide some insight into what likely will happen as a result of the decisions that you're going to make in this contract and throughout this process. And so here's what that's likely going to look like. here's some things to watch out for. It's a very consultative approach, and it really is, kind of going back to your original point in question, it is designed to help them understand what they're about to go through so that they're prepared as possible for it.
Right. And I see a lot of agents who aren't as experienced as you, because I can see that you would be accused of not being very emotional in a contract, but you're just being a pragmatist. We've got to get from point A to point B. And my job, you've hired me to get this sold for you at the best price and the best terms that we can reasonably come to. And I think if everybody would just pay attention to that a little bit more and not try to make themselves, like you said, some of the agents I see out there, they're just trying to make themselves look like, I don't know, hot shots or, I think a better way to approach it, I've just seen 2 or 3 contracts fall apart this week alone where it was completely, it wasn't even the buyer or the seller. It was all agent driven with the angst and trying to be tough guys and negotiate and, and some of it is just pointless. Like I try to tell my clients, try not to negotiate against yourself. How about you just push that out there and see what their reaction is before you start coming up with plan A, plan B, plan C. I'm going to react like this. Let's just see what happens. And let's try to stay as calm as possible and reasonable as possible because we all want the same thing. You want to buy, they want to sell.
Yeah, and
and we can come to reasonable terms calmly.
As you're saying, and by the way, guys, we're live in the studio with Rex Ann Strecker, and we'd love to hear from you if you have any questions. 843-556-1250 is the number in the studio for you to give us a call and ask your questions. I was just thinking as you were saying that we run into a lot of issues with regard to the way real estate agents write contracts.
Yes.
And some they just get it wrong or they don't have that attention to detail. What's interesting is when you really start to dig as a business owner that's, hired and trained, 100 plus people,
right.
You really start digging into things like personality profiles, right? And who would be a good match naturally for the role that I'm going to hire them for.
Correct.
If you're going to be a buyer agent, you can't be like an introvert.
No.
You have to learn how to build relationships with people based on trust, and trust is earned, right? Not freely given.
Right.
And so that means being the type of agent that is constantly providing value and educating folks. But they're also not the best at attention to detail.
Correct.
Right? The person that's really outgoing is not the person behind the desk that's like the perfect assistant model that crosses every T and dots every I. Most of the time, their paperwork's a nightmare, if I'm being honest.
Well, I don't see that side, but yeah, we get the contracts once they're written.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
And I'm sure you've seen many of them where you're like, how in the world did you guys come up with that language?
Well, yeah, I
just had an offer this week on a property where the contract that was sent was an old contract. It wasn't even a contract we use as a state adopted contract anymore. And it had ambiguous language on there that said contingent upon the buyer's satisfaction with the results of the home inspection, which is just like if we were to go back in time like 10, 15 years, that was a fairly common thing that people tried to get away with.
Right.
Which when you really understand, contracts, that is a get out of jail free card.
It is.
Because of the ambiguity of the language.
Correct.
There's no deadline attached to that. They could just say, before closing, at the end of the day, we just weren't satisfied with the home inspection. And those are the little things that, sometimes agents have had to learn the hard way. But then when you sell real estate for 20 years, you see, I'm never going to say that I've seen it all because I get surprised more often than you'd think. With
I wake up every morning thinking,
and
good
scenarios.
Lord, hopefully today I won't be shocked and I'll be doggone. At the end of the day, I was shocked by something.
We do have a caller. We're going to go to Glenn in Mount Pleasant. Glenn, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Brian.
Good. How can I help you today?
So I was looking at houses actually in another area, and I was presented with an agency agreement for the agent to represent me as the buyer, and that had a provision in it that would require me to pay the 3% commission as opposed to what I'm used to, where it comes out of the seller's profit, if you will.
Right.
And I guess there's another type. Is there some law that's changed or something new? Because it was very strange to me.
Well, I'll tell you this: I've not mentioned this on this program because it's still so fresh. I think I need a little more time to pass before I comment on the litigation that's occurred on a national level with regard to a bunch of agents being sued for basically price fixing commissions into the transaction that they're then forcing people to pay.
Right.
I agree to an extent with the basis of the lawsuit, but we can get into that at a later date. As it relates to your specific question, Glenn, the buyer agency agreement, if is it South Carolina?
Yes, that's correct.
So the South Carolina buyer agency agreement, I can't comment on other states, even though I have coached people all over the country as a real estate coach. But what I can tell you is that is not uncommon. It really requires a meaningful explanation, though. So when it comes to compensation to the buyer agent, there's a few different options. Mm-hmm. One option states that, hey, whatever the seller is going to pay me is what I'm going to get. It's just you're being paid out of the transaction. There's another option that sounds like the option that this particular agent chose, which states that, hey, my commission is X, whatever it is, likely 3% is what they write in. And if the seller is not going to pay me a commission, then you have to pay me the commission. However, I have to use my best efforts to obtain payment out of the transaction from the seller, which is essentially how it reads. So for us, Glenn, as an example, depending upon what you're looking to accomplish, we would likely ask the same thing with the caveat that anything that's for sale right now that's publicly listed, that's in the MLS, has a commission attached to it that the seller has already agreed to pay the buyer agent. If, however, we find a property that's not on the market, then let's say we find a seller just through our own database that says, hey, I'd sell the home, but I don't want it publicly listed for sale. In that instance, you would be presented with that opportunity, but then you would have to pay the buyer agent commission. So it just depends on what type of relationship I think you want to have with the agent and how far they're going to go to help you sell your property. But I'm sorry, we're out of time. Thank you so much for the call, Glenn. We can continue that conversation off air. Thanks again for listening to the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show. And thank you, Rex Ann Strecker, for being here. You guys have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend.
Join us for another edition of the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 10. Find him online at listingsincharleston.com. That's listingsincharleston.com. Or call him at 843-800-0065. That's 843-800-0065.